The machine gun bullets hissed past my ears like angry hornets as I pressed my face against the coral sand, tasting blood and salt water. Around me, Marines screamed and died in the shallow lagoon of Betio Island, their bodies floating face down in water that had turned crimson. My Higgins boat sat stranded on the reef, 200 yards from shore, its bottom torn open by razor-sharp coral. The Japanese had turned this tiny speck of land into a killing field, and we had walked straight into their trap. My name is Sergeant Tommy Chen, and I was 22 years old when I first saw hell on Earth. It was November 20th, 1943, and I was part of the 2nd Marine Division's assault on Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. What was supposed to be a quick 3-day operation to secure an airfield became the bloodiest 76 hours in Marine Corps history up to that point. The morning had started with such promise. As our convoy of transports approached the atoll in the pre-dawn darkness, the silhouette of Betio Island looked deceptively peaceful against the star-filled sky. It was barely 2 miles long and 800 yards wide. At its widest point, you could walk across it in 10 minutes. But what we couldn't see in the darkness was the elaborate fortress the Japanese had spent over a year building. "Look at that little sandbar," my buddy Private First Class Danny Rodriguez had said, leaning against the rail of our transport ship. "We'll be eating lunch on that beach, Tommy. Mark my words." I wish I could have shared his confidence. Something about the intelligence briefings had bothered me. The Navy claimed their 3-hour bombardment would neutralize all Japanese defenses. But I'd seen aerial photos of those concrete bunkers. They looked too thick, too well built to be destroyed by even the heaviest shells. As the sun rose that morning, the naval bombardment began. The sound was indescribable, a continuous rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very ocean itself. Battleships USS Maryland and USS Colorado opened up with their 16-inch guns, their massive shells screaming overhead like freight trains. The concussion from each shot hit us like a physical blow, and we had to hold our helmets to keep them from flying off our heads. For 3 hours, we watched Betio Island disappear under a curtain of smoke and flame. Shells crashed into the beach defenses every few seconds. Surely nothing could survive such devastation. When the bombardment finally lifted, the island looked like the surface of the moon, cratered, smoking, seemingly lifeless. "That's it, boys," shouted our company commander, Captain William Hawkins. "Jerry's had it. We're going to walk ashore." The first wave of Marines loaded into their Higgins boats with high spirits. These were the new LVTs, landing vehicles tracked that could crawl over the coral reef and deliver troops directly to the beach. But there weren't enough of them. The second and third waves, including my unit, would have to use the older Higgins boats that drew too much water to clear the reef. As the first wave headed toward shore, we watched from our transport ship through binoculars. The LVTs looked like determined beetles crawling across the lagoon. At first, everything seemed quiet. Too quiet. Then the Japanese opened fire. The sound carried across the water a rapid chatter of machine guns, the crack of rifles, the boom of artillery. Suddenly, the lagoon erupted in geysers of white water as Japanese guns found their range. We watched in horror as several LVTs exploded in balls of flame, their crews and Marine passengers vaporized in an instant. Danny whispered, "They're getting slaughtered." But the first wave pressed on. Those Marines who made it to the beach immediately came under devastating fire. Through our binoculars, we could see them scrambling for cover behind the low seawall that ran along the beach. Some didn't make it that far. Bodies floated in the surf, rolling back and forth with each wave. Despite the carnage, our orders remained the same. Land on Red Beach 1 and advance inland. As we climbed down the cargo nets into our Higgins boats, I said a prayer for the first time since basic training. The boat coxswain, a young sailor who couldn't have been more than 19, was pale as death. "You boys ready for this?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Ready as we'll ever be," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Our boat joined the formation of dozens of others, all packed with Marines. The water was choppy, and several men got seasick. The smell of vomit mixed with diesel fuel and fierce sweat. Nobody talked much. We all knew what we were heading into. As we approached the lagoon, the Japanese fire intensified. I could see muzzle flashes winking from concealed positions all along the beach. The enemy had survived the bombardment because their bunkers were built too well. Reinforced concrete, steel, and coral, they'd created an impregnable fortress. "Hang on, boys," the coxswain shouted. "We're going in." That's when disaster struck. About 200 yards from the beach, our boat shuddered to a halt. The propeller had hit the coral reef. We were stuck fast, sitting ducks in the middle of the lagoon. "Everybody out," I yelled. "We go in on foot." The ramp dropped, and immediately machine gun fire raked our position. The first Marine off the boat, Private Jenkins from Alabama, took a bullet in the chest and fell backward into the boat. Blood sprayed across my face. "Move! Move! Move!" I screamed, pushing the men forward. We jumped into water that came up to our chests. The bottom was sharp coral that cut through our boots. Carrying full packs and equipment, we struggled toward shore as bullets whined around us. The water provided no protection. The Japanese were using armor-piercing ammunition that cut through it like air. To my left, I saw Danny Rodriguez stumble and fall. A red stain spread across his chest as he sank beneath the surface. I tried to reach him, but Corporal Martinez grabbed my arm. "He's gone, Sergeant." "Keep moving." The 200 yards to the beach felt like 2 miles. Men fell with every step. Some were hit by bullets, others by shrapnel from mortar rounds that exploded in the water around us. The lucky ones died instantly. The unlucky ones screamed for their mothers as they bled out in the coral-sharp shallows. I made it to the beach with 7 men out of the 36 who had started from our boat. We crawled behind the seawall, gasping for breath. The concrete barrier was only 3 feet high, but it provided blessed protection from the murderous fire. The scene behind the seawall was chaos. Wounded Marines lay everywhere, some calling for corpsmen, others silent in death. Radio operators tried desperately to contact the ships offshore, but most of their equipment had been destroyed by seawater or shrapnel. "What's the situation, Sergeant?" asked Lieutenant Colonel David Shoup, the battalion commander. He'd been wounded in the leg, but was still directing operations. "We're getting cut to pieces, sir," I reported. "The Japs are in concrete bunkers. Our rifle fire isn't even scratching them." Shoup nodded grimly. "Flamethrowers and demolitions. That's the only way we're going to dig them out." The Japanese defenders were fighting with the fanaticism of men who expected to die. They had built their bunkers in interlocking fields of fire, so that every approach to the beach was covered by multiple machine gun positions. When one position was attacked, the others would provide covering fire. The heat was unbearable. The tropical sun beat down on us mercilessly, and we had no fresh water. Many of the wounded died not from their injuries, but from dehydration and shock. The smell of death was everywhere, cordite, blood, and the sweet stench of bodies decomposing in the heat. As the day wore on, more Marines made it to the beach. But for every man who reached the seawall, 2 more died in the lagoon. The water was choked with bodies, equipment, and the wreckage of destroyed landing craft. "We need to move inland," I told my remaining men. "We can't stay here." Beyond the seawall lay the airfield, our primary objective. But between us and the runway were dozens of Japanese strongpoints. Concrete bunkers, palm log pillboxes, and spider holes dug into the coral. Each one had to be taken individually, usually at the cost of several Marine lives. Our first target was a bunker about 50 yards inland. It housed a Japanese machine gun that had been raking the beach all day. Private Wilson, our flamethrower operator, had madied ashore with his equipment intact. Wilson, I called. "You see that bunker? Can you get close enough to torch it?" The young Marine nodded, his face grim behind his mask. "I can try, Sergeant." The assault on that first bunker took 2 hours. Wilson had to crawl through scattered palm trees and coral outcroppings while the Japanese poured fire at him. Twice he was forced to retreat when grenades exploded nearby. But finally, he reached the bunker's rear entrance. The sound of the flamethrower was like a dragon's breath. Screams echoed from inside the bunker as the Japanese defenders were incinerated. When Wilson emerged, he was shaking. "Never want to do that again," he said simply. But we had to. All across the tiny island, similar scenes played out. Marines advancing by inches, paying in blood for every yard of ground. The Japanese fought from prepared positions, forcing us to come to them. And they made us pay dearly for every victory. By nightfall of the first day, we had advanced less than 100 yards inland. The casualties were horrific. Of the 5,000 Marines who had landed on Betio, over 1,500 were already dead or wounded. The beach was carpeted with bodies, and the lagoon was still full of men trying to wade ashore. The Japanese launched several counterattacks during the night. They came at us with bayonets and grenades, screaming "Banzai" as they charged. We fought them off with rifle fire and hand grenades, but it was close quarters combat at its most brutal. I'll never forget the sound of that fighting. The crack of rifles, the explosion of grenades, the screams of wounded men. And underneath it all, the constant chatter of machine guns. The Japanese had placed their weapons expertly so that every position could support the others. Dawn of the second day brought no relief. The Japanese were as determined as ever, and they had the advantage of fighting from prepared positions. But more Marines kept arriving, and slowly, very slowly, we began to push inland. The breakthrough came when we captured the airfield. A team of engineers had managed to get a bulldozer ashore, and they used it to crush several Japanese bunkers. The enemy fell back to their final defensive positions on the eastern end of the island. But the Japanese weren't finished. They had prepared their last stand carefully. The eastern end of Betio was a maze of bunkers and trenches, all interconnected and mutually supporting. To take it, we would have to fight for every position. The final assault began at dawn on the third day. By now, we had tanks ashore, Sherman M4s that could punch through the Japanese bunkers with their 75mm guns. But even with armor support, the advance was slow and costly. I was part of the assault team that attacked the main Japanese command bunker. It was a massive concrete structure that had somehow survived 3 days of bombardment. The Japanese inside were still fighting, their rifles and machine guns firing through steel-reinforced loopholes. "Bangalore torpedoes," I shouted. "Blow a hole in that thing." The engineers ran forward with their explosives, dodging Japanese fire. One man fell, then another, but the survivors managed to place their charges. The explosion shook the ground and blew a gaping hole in the bunker wall. "Go! Go! Go!" I led the charge through the breach. Inside, the bunker was a maze of concrete rooms and corridors. The Japanese fought room by room, often to the last man. We used flamethrowers, grenades, and bayonets in combat so close you could smell your enemy's breath. In one room, I came face to face with a Japanese officer. He was wounded, blood streaming from a head wound, but he still held his sword. For a moment, we stared at each other across the small space. Then he charged. I shot him 3 times with my M1 Garand before he fell. As he lay dying, he said something in Japanese, probably a prayer or a curse. I'll never know which. By noon on November 23rd, organized Japanese resistance had ended. The few survivors had retreated to the very tip of the island, where they made their final stand. Some threw themselves into the ocean rather than surrender. Others detonated grenades, taking their own lives in a final act of defiance. When it was over, the silence was deafening. For 3 days, Betio had echoed with the sounds of battle. Now there was only the whisper of waves on the coral beach and the cries of wounded men. The cost had been staggering. Of the 5,000 Marines who had landed on Betio, over 1,000 were dead and 2,000 wounded. Nearly every man who set foot on that island was either killed or wounded. But we had taken our objective. The Japanese losses were even more complete. Off 4,800 defenders, only 146 were taken prisoner, most of them Korean laborers. The rest had died fighting. They had turned Betio into a fortress, and they had defended it to the last man. As I walked across the battlefield that final afternoon, I tried to make sense of what we had accomplished. The airfield was ours. The strategic position was secure. But the price had been almost too high to bear. I found Danny Rodriguez's body washed up on the beach. He looked peaceful, as if he were sleeping. I knelt beside him and said a prayer for his soul. He had been right about one thing: we had eaten lunch on that beach. But it had taken us 3 days, and the cost had been measured in blood. The Battle of Tarawa was a turning point in the Pacific War. It taught us valuable lessons about amphibious warfare that would save countless lives in future operations. But those lessons came at a terrible price. As I sit here now, more than 80 years later, I can still smell the cordite and blood on that coral beach. I can still hear the screams of wounded Marines and the chatter of Japanese machine guns. Betio was only 2 miles long and 800 yards wide, but it took 3 days of the most brutal fighting in Marine Corps history to secure it. We called it Operation Galvanic, but the Marines who fought there had a different name for it. We called it the place where Marines lento die, because that's what Tarawa taught us, that even the smallest piece of enemy territory would be defended with fanatical courage, and that victory would always come at a price. The Japanese had built Betio into what they claimed was an impregnable fortress. They said it would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to take it. We proved them wrong, but we paid for that proof with the blood of America's finest young men. Today, Betio is a peaceful place. Palm trees grow where bunkers once stood. Children play on beaches that once ran red with blood. But for those of us who were there, who lived through those 76 hours of hell, Tarawa will always be a place of ghosts. Every November 20th, I think about the boys who didn't make it home. Danny Rodriguez, who dreamed of opening a restaurant in East LA. Private Jenkins, who carried pictures of his 2 young daughters. Corporal Martinez, who was going to marry his sweetheart when the war ended. They gave their lives for 2 miles of coral and sand, and in doing so, they helped win the war in the Pacific. The Battle of Tarawa showed America what it would take to defeat Japan. It would require courage, sacrifice, and a willingness to pay any price for victory. The Marines who fought at Tarawa provided all 3. They died so that others might live in freedom, and their sacrifice will never be forgotten. As I fold the flag that covered Danny's coffin all those years ago, I remember the words of our commanding general. Tarawa was not taken in 76 hours, but in a lifetime of preparation by the men who fought there. We were ready when our country called, and we answered that call with our blood. The coral beaches of Betio are peaceful now, but they are consecrated ground. They are hallowed by the sacrifice of Marines who gave their lives for their country and their brothers in arms. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, we who fought Tarawa and lived to tell the tale. In the end, that's what war is about. Not the grand strategies or the political objectives, but the bonds between men who face death together. On Betio, we learned that no force on earth can defeat Americans who are fighting for each other. The Japanese had built an impregnable fortress, but they had not counted on the indomitable spirit of the United States Marine Corps. We took Tarawa because we had to. We held it because we could. And we won because we were Americans, and Americans don't quit. That's the lesson of Betio, written in blood on coral sand. preserved forever in the memory of those who were there. The battle for Tarawa was over, but the war in the Pacific had just begun. The lessons we learned in those 76 hours of hell would guide us through the battles yet to come. From Saipan to Iwo Jima, from Peleliu to Okinawa, American Marines would carry the memory of Tarawa with them. We had learned that the Japanese would fight to the death for every inch of territory. We had learned that victory would always come at a price. And we had learned that American Marines, fighting for each other and for their country, were capable of achieving the impossible. The coral beach off Betio stand as eternal testimony to that truth. They are a monument to American courage, sacrifice, and determination. They are a reminder that freedom is not free, and that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. As the sun sets over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the battlefield where so many good men died, I offer one final prayer for my fallen brothers. They answered their country's call, and they gave their lives so that others might live in freedom. Their sacrifice will never be forgotten, and their memory will live forever in the hearts of all who value liberty. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. That's the motto of the United States Marine Corps, and it's the promise we made to each other on the beaches of Tarawa. Faithful to our country, faithful to our Corps, and faithful to the memory of those who gave their lives for freedom. The battle for Tarawa is over, but the legend lives on. In the halls of Montezuma and the shores of Tripoli, in the frozen mountains of Korea and the jungles of Vietnam, wherever Marines have fought and died for their country, the spirit of Tarawa has been with them. We are the proud, the few, the Marines. And we will never forget the lessons learned on the coral beaches of Betio Island, where heroes were born and legends were made in 76 hours of hell.